Chapter 10 Brilland Sharn. Little sunlight reached the streets of high walls, and the filthy windows of the Manticore might just as well have been made of stone for all of the light they let through. Alina's parchments were scattered across the floor of the small room. Lay had woven an illuminating enchantment into a small crystal she'd been carrying, and she was using this light to read the documents. Dane paced back and forth, and Jode sat on the floor, while Pierce remained as silent and impassive as a statue. "Time is of the essence," Dane said. "For all we know, Raciel has already sold the shards. It's possible they will be smuggled out of the city before we can find them. If this is the case, Alina will at least expect us to find out who is in possession of the goods. Whatever happens, we need to find Raciel fast." The fourth bell rang, pure tones echoing throughout the vast well of Tabik's Landing. "We have a dinner invitation, if we want it. Jode and I met Teral Irsaurus, an old counselor from the Syrian court. It may be a waste of time. He's a politician, so he may just be a currying favor. But if he knows the residents of this district, he could be a useful contact, especially if we're going to be here for a while. What else do we have to work with?" Jode spoke up. "Raciel Tan served in the Sharn Watch for several years, serving with the Gold Wing Guards for the last 3 years of his career. During that time, he lived in the Dagger Watch district of Upper Dura. Most of the guardsmen are based there. Hopefully our friend from the lift isn't going to pursue the matter. But I don't think it's a great idea for you to be asking questions in a garrison right about now, Dane. And you think she's forgotten about you? You only stuck a knife in through her knee." Jode shrugged. "Subtlety is my strength. I won't be recognized." Dane scowled, but nodded. Jode was far better at digging up information than Lay or Pierce, and this might take a delicate touch. "As you wish. What else?" "It seems that Raciel has a particular gift for handling hippogriffs. That's why he was recruited by the Gold Wings. But in his free time, he spent a great deal of time racing. Harris Folly in Middle Dura seems to be a center for wind chasing and other aerial sports. Alina's notes provide the locations of a few arenas and gambling halls. But he's not racing anymore." "No. The largest race in Sharn is called the Race of 8 Winds. It happens once a year. 2 years ago, Raciel won the race on behalf of Daggerwatch and the Hippogriff. Last year, he rode for the Hippogriff again. But there was some sort of accident, and he was almost killed. After that, he dropped off the horizon, quit the guard, stopped racing. And that's what we have to work with." "What about the shards?" said Dane, looking to Lay. If she'd heard him, she gave no sign. "Lay? Lay." Lay looked up from the parchment she was studying. She had been distant since they'd returned from Darkheart Woods, and her voice was cool and emotionless. "Dragon shards are magically active minerals. Common Eberron dragon shards store and focus magical energy. These form the basis of many of the conveniences we take for granted, such as the ever-bright lantern. Sky shards fall from the ring of Siberis. These amplify the natural powers of a dragon mark. Siphis message stones, Jurasco altars of healing, they all rely on sky shards." "So, what are we dealing with?" "Kyber shards. These are found in veins deep below the earth, and are said to be the dried blood of the dark progenitor worm. Just as the first fiends are said to be bound by the blood of Kyber, deep dragon shards are used to bind spirits and elemental energies. The lightning rail, airships, bonded sails. These are all made possible by Kyber's dragon shards. Lay stood up and began to pace, unconsciously echoing Dane's earlier movements. But these are only the broadest categories. Purity, color, size. All of these things can play a factor in the value and use of a particular dragon shard. She pointed at the page. Your friend is trying to acquire a very unusual form of Kyber shard. It appears to resonate with dragon mark energy, much like a Siberis shard. And so? Siberis shards amplify energy, but Kyber shards bind it. I'm still not following. What can it do? Lay shrugged. If this material truly can bind dragon-marked energies, you might be able to use it to create some sort of shield against dragon-marked effects. Or a manacle that could prevent a prisoner from using his dragon mark. But it's impossible to say. These notes are purely theoretical. How did Alina learn of the shards? Asked Dane, and who she was dealing with to obtain them. I was hoping you'd tell me. My family are the finest artificers of this or any age. For a moment, her eyes went distant. Yet I've never heard of these shards before. I can't begin to imagine what your friend would have to pay to find them, let alone to buy them. Who is this Alina, and why would she be interested in these shards? Jode spoke before Dane could come up with an answer. I met Alina Lyris in Metrol 8 years ago. Shortly after, I began fighting for Seer. She was dealing in contraband goods, and I heard that she was selling secrets to the Syrian court. I am sure of 3 things. Alina is deadly, cunning, and has more wealth than you can imagine. She claims her fortune comes from gem mines in the Seawall Mountains, but don't believe it. From what I've heard, there are few things she hasn't tried, business and otherwise. So what does she want? Control. Knowledge, secrets, personal power. I don't think that she cares about money. It's all a game she plays with other people's lives. And now she's the new boss, Dane said with a scowl. Lay looked at Dane for a moment, perhaps wondering how he had come into contact with Alina, what fueled his bitterness. But her own sorrow weighed heavily on her shoulders, and she said nothing. Dane took a deep breath and turned back to the matter at hand. So, the shards are unusual. Can we use that? Could you track them, Lay? She considered. I can craft a temporary divining rod easily enough, but it will only have a range of around 1,000 feet, and the enchantment will only last for a few minutes after it's activated. So you won't want to use it unless you're pretty sure of yourself. It's better than nothing. Do it. Then we've got the matter of your Uncle Jura, and visiting the wind. What was that? Lay shrugged. I don't know. She glanced over at the dark wood staff, which was leaning against the corner of the room. That staff, it is magical, but so far, I haven't been able to discern its function, unless it's cursed. Not something we should rule out, Jode said. Lay continued. It seems unlikely Jura would give away a powerful item as part of a fool's errand, even if it was cursed. What would be his motive for giving it to us? I don't know, Jode said, studying a fingernail. Perhaps he thinks getting rid of you will buy him favor in the house? Maybe he's trapped the banshee in the staff, and at the stroke of midnight, it will kill us all with its horrible wail. Lay just stared at him. Yeah, That seems likely, Dane said.
Look, Lay said, I don't know if I trust Jura. He's not the man I knew. But I don't think he tried to harm me. Whatever's happened, we're still family. I think this could help us.
Dane scowled. We should check it out quickly then. What do you know about Malian's Gate?
One of the most dangerous districts in Sharn, at least for humans. Most of the goblins and their kin live there, and I've heard that stranger creatures have been drifting east from Droam.
It's not likely that Uncle Jura is sending us into a bad neighborhood to be slaughtered and killed?
Dane, Lay sighed. I trust him.
She considered a moment, then added,
Well, more or less.
You fought an army of Dargul raiders at Senan Wrath, Captain, Pierce said calmly. This can hardly be as dangerous of a situation. Spoken like a man who still has all of his weapons. Dane shot a glance at Jode, who at least had the grace to look embarrassed. But you're right. Still, it sounds like we should stay together for this. Afterwards, we'll split up to investigate Dagger Watch and Hareth's Folly, and meet back here for dinner with Lord Terrell. The others nodded. Very well, Dane said, as Jode gathered the papers and Lay picked up the staff. Let's go talk to the wind. Breland Sharn. High Walls, the newfound home of the Syrian refugees in Sharn, was a depressing ghetto. For decades, the government of Sharn had worried only about maintaining the gates and the guards, and not about the comfort of those trapped behind the walls. Poverty, fear, and uncertainty were a part of everyday life. Compared to Malian's Gate, it was paradise. When human settlers first came to Corvair, they found the remains of a great goblin empire, a civilization shattered long ago and left to ruin. Hobgoblins and bugbears lurked in the mountains and harsh lands, while goblins remained in the ruins of their ancient cities. But the humans of Sarlona were determined to claim this new land as their own. When Malian the Reaver landed on the shores of the Dagger River, he enslaved the local goblins and forced them to work on his fortress city, a city that would be destroyed in the War of the Mark. 600 years later, King Galifar began work on the city of Sharn, and he promised freedom to all goblins who would serve him as soldiers and laborers. But few human inhabitants of the city ever accepted the goblins as true equals, and racial violence was an everyday occurrence. Eventually, most of Sharn's goblins settled in a single district, trusting in numbers to provide safety and shelter. But safety and prosperity were two different things. While Malian's Gate had always been a place of poverty and misery, it was only over the last century that it had become truly dangerous. Two new nations had arisen in the wake of the last war, taking advantage of the chaos and the fragmentation of the proud army of Galifar. Seer and Breland had both used goblinoid mercenaries in the war, drawing the cunning hobgoblins and powerful bugbears down from the mountains to augment their armies. Eventually, these creatures outnumbered the human soldiers in the Eastern Front. The hobgoblins ruled Corvair long before humanity had arrived, and a charismatic warlord was determined to use the fall of Galifar as a stepping stone for the future of his people. He managed to win the loyalty of many of the other mercenary chieftains, and at a critical point in the war, the soldiers turned on both sides and laid claim to the territory they were supposed to be protecting, proclaiming the new nation of Dargoon. With the last war at its height, neither Beland nor Seer could afford to retaliate. Both still needed goblin troops, though the commanders were considerably more cautious about the concentration of such forces. Even now, with the war winding to a close, the remnants of the Five Nations lacked the resources or resolve to move against Darguun. Representatives of the Hobgoblin King were seated at the Council of Thronehold, debating the future of Corvair. A number of former and current mercenaries had settled in Sharn, and they naturally gravitated towards the greatest concentration of their own kind. But where the city goblins of Sharn tried to avoid conflict with the human citizens, the Darguls viewed humanity with disdain. The Sharn Watch had long ago abandoned the gate, and any human or elf who entered the district was on his own. But the hobgoblins were not the only creatures to emerge from the shadows of the war. All manner of monsters, harpies, ogres, trolls, and even more terrible things filled the lands around the Bayeshk Mountains. Even the Knights of Galifar had avoided the haunted woods and wastes of this land. While it had always been a place of dark legend, the horrors of Droam never reached into the lands beyond until the last war. Over the last century, 3 terrible sisters, each hag a legend in her own right, seized control of the region and began to reshape and transform it, creating a nation from raw chaos. Over the last 2 decades, the creatures of Droam began to appear in the eastern lands, selling their services. Gargoyle scouts and couriers could be invaluable, and many businesses could use the raw strength of an ogre laborer. The monstrous population of Sharn had grown over the last few years, and while most of these creatures preferred to live in the tunnels beneath the city, a fair number had settled in Malian's Gate, adding to both the color and danger of the district. Over the course of the war, Dane had fought many Dargul warriors, and he could smell the aggression in the smoky air of Malian's Gate. On his command, the group drew weapons as soon as they entered the district. With an arrow nocked in his massive longbow, Pierce took up the rear. Lay was resplendent in green leather vest, studded with gold. This was an heirloom of her house, and the golden rivets were especially receptive to the temporary enchantments she could produce. She held the Darkwood staff at the ready. Jode was a healer by trade, but he had served as a scout, and could fight when he had to. Though his sword would be little more than a knife in the hands of a man, it was finely crafted and razor sharp. Dane had his dagger drawn, the adamantine blade catching the guttering torchlight, and for the 100th time he cursed sword-pawning halflings. Malian's Gate, one of the oldest districts in Sharn, had served as a ghetto since the earliest days of Sharn, and its age was obvious even to the casual observer. The stonework was rough and angular in comparison to the smooth curves of Tavik's Landing and Memphis Plateau. Mold and mildew covered the walls inside and out. If there had ever been cold fire lanterns in the district, they had been shattered or stolen long ago. Most of the denizens of the Malian's Gate could see in the dark, and outsiders had to find their way by the light of a few smoky torches. The narrow streets were full of noise and chaos. Goblins were everywhere, haggling, arguing, or simply shouting in the harsh goblin tongue. A massive bugbear forced its way through a pack of goblins, flinging the smaller creatures left and right. By contrast, when a trio of heavily armed hobgoblins emerged from a dingy tavern, the crowd instantly parted. Clearly, the warriors of Dargun were not to be trifled with. The commander of the trio met Dane's eyes, and for a moment, the former adversaries studied one another. Then the moment passed, and the soldiers sauntered down the street. Dane breathed a sigh of relief. There could be any number of Darguls within shouting distance, and if blood was spilled there was no telling how quickly the situation would escalate. So, where do we find this broken church? He said, glancing back at Lay.
I'm afraid my family never visited Malian's Gate on my trips to Sharn, said Lay. Perhaps you should ask for directions.
Dane studied the few bystanders. Somehow I think we'd be more likely to get a knife in the gut than useful advice. Let's keep on. They explored the streets. Gleaming red eyes watched suspiciously from the shadows. But Dane kept his dagger in view, and no one approached. On one street, a sharp shriek pierced the gloom as a harpy passed overhead. The half-human creature spun around, and a ball of spit and phlegm struck Dane in the face. Dane grabbed Pierce's arm before the Warforged could release an arrow. "Let it go," he said. "We're the outsiders here." He wiped his face and rubbed his hand on his cloak. Turning a corner, they came upon a granite statue of a club-wielding goblin, its face frozen in rage. "I'm not sure about the taste," Jode said, "but it's nice to have an attempt to bring a little artistic flair to the region."
"It's not a statue," said Lay. She studied the perfect lines of the statue. "This unfortunate fellow was once very much alive. Something changed him to stone. Medusa, unless I miss my guess. Though, I suppose it could be a basilisk."
Jode stumbled, and looking down found that he had tripped over the arm of a shattered second statue. "Lovely! Can we get this over with? Dinner with Counselor Terral is sounding more attractive every minute." The next living residents they encountered were a pair of goblins, a male and a female, engaged in a heated debate. Sheathing his dagger, Jode walked over and hailed them in the goblin tongue, somehow managing to make even that harsh language seem cheerful. The goblins were momentarily dumbfounded by the interruption, but their demeanor changed once Jode produced a few copper crowns. The male goblin reached for the coins with a snarl, but as he did, his companion struck him in the head with a mighty double-fisted blow, and he sank senseless to the ground. The woman took the coins and engaged in a brief animated conversation. Jode returned to the group, and the goblin dragged her fallen comrade out of the street.
"What did he say?" Lay asked.
"She said that she sympathized, as her fool of a husband wouldn't ask for directions either." Jode grinned. "I've got directions, and I'd say there's at least half odds that she was telling the truth."
"Lead on, then."
The broken church had been abandoned long ago, its holy trappings stripped away and only bare fragments remaining on the once beautiful windows of colored crystal. Fire and acid had scarred the walls. On the steps, two monsters were engaged in a brutal battle. One was a minotaur, at least 8 feet tall. Powerful muscles rippled beneath a sleek coat of black fur. He wore a black loincloth embroidered with golden sigils, and his long horns were bound with bands of brass. His opponent was a bugbear, a 7-foot blend of ursine and goblin features. His light brown fur was unkempt and patchy, his clothes torn, and one of his fangs was missing. The two were fighting barehanded, and it was clear that the bugbear was getting the worst of it. Studying the steps, Dane noticed the bugbear's missing fang lying a few feet away. Dane could see that the bugbear was barely standing. The Minotaur ended the battle with a single mighty headbutt. The bugbear fell down the steps, blood streaming from nose and mouth. It did come to a stop, its head resting on the second step, and did not move again. The Minotaur studied its fallen foe for a moment, then looked over at Dane. "Move on, outsiders," he rumbled, his voice hoarse and deep. "You have no business here." "On the contrary," Jode said, skipping forward. "We were sent to, well, talk to the wind. Is that you? We have a gift." Lay held up the staff. The Minotaur roared, and Dane had almost grabbed Jode before he realized that the creature was laughing. "You would enter," the Minotaur snorted. "You think you can defeat me?" Dane felt foolish challenging this juggernaut with his tiny dagger, but its keen edge had served him well. "What's your tone? Size isn't everything. There's 4 of us to your 1, and you're not even armed, so why don't you step aside?" The monster fixed Dane with its inhuman eyes. "Don't threaten me, little man. I am appointed to guard this gate, and only I can open it. You face me, or you do not pass. 1 person, no weapons, 1 chance." Dane stepped back and turned to his companions. "What do you think?" he said quietly. "I know when I'm outmatched. Pierce?" "I am willing to try, Captain." "No. I'll do it." It was Lay. The other 3 looked over, surprised. "What are you talking about?" "Jura said this person wanted to see me. He gave me the staff. For all we know, I have to do it." Dane blinked. "Yes, but..." He glanced back as the Minotaur lifted up the unconscious bugbear and threw him from the steps. "What are you going to do against that?" "He said no weapons. I can handle that better than you can. Trust me, Dane. With all that I've been through the last 2 days, I'm going to enjoy this." "Your uncle, your decision," Dane shrugged. "Jode, be ready to help her the instant she needs it." The halfling nodded. Lay turned and bowed to the Minotaur. It watched her, its inhuman expression impossible to read. Handing the Darkwood staff to Pierce, Lay ran her fingers along the studs of her armor, murmuring quietly. Then she produced a pinch of powdered stone from her pouch and rubbed it into the leather of her belt. Dane recognized the mystical significance of her actions, but he had no idea what enchantments she was weaving into her clothing. After a few minutes, Lay's preparations were complete. She turned and walked toward the Minotaur, pausing at the bottom of the steps. She stood straight and tall, her arms at her sides, and took 1 slow, deep breath. "I wish to talk to the wind," she said. The Guardian nodded. Then, without warning, he charged down the steps, a blur of black and gold. Lay was no soldier. She had been assigned to Dane's unit to care for the Warforged. By the rules of war, she was a non-combatant, safe from the danger of battle so long as she posed no threat to anyone involved. Most artificers and mage rights had relied entirely on this pledge to serve as their shield. But Lay's parents had not been so trusting. She was no warrior, but she'd been taught to defend herself with both magical and martial skill. To the others, the Minotaur might be moving with blinding speed, but Lay had prepared for the fight, and to her enchanted eyes, the beast was like a bull charging through 3 feet of mud. She barely moved, slipping just beyond his reach, and turning as he rumbled past. The Minotaur turned to face her, and Lay raised her left hand. With a whispered word, she activated the power stored within her glove, and a dark bolt lanced out to strike her foe. Shadows wreathed the Minotaur, blue light tracing his muscles as the magic leached the energy from his sinews. But the Minotaur was already in motion, and he slammed into Lei before she could slip out of the way. The golden studs of Lei's armor flared with light, and a shimmering field of translucent energy deflected much of the raw force of the blow, but the sheer momentum of the attack threw her to the ground. Lei cursed as she struggled to her feet. Never start a fight, never draw a blade. Her parents had taught her defense, but the first principle of defense was to avoid the fight. Challenging a Minotaur, what would her mother say to such foolishness? She hadn't hurt the Minotaur, but she had weakened him, and he was acting with more caution. They circled for a moment, then Lei slipped forward and past him, coming up behind and planting a powerful kick where she thought his kidneys might be. But if the Minotaur felt any pain, he didn't show it, and Lei had left her open with the attack. Grunting, the beast slapped her with a powerful backhand blow. Her enchanted armor kept her on her feet, but for a moment the world went black, and when her vision cleared, a monstrous fist was flying toward her face. Calling on every ounce of will, Lei dropped beneath the blow and slipped forward. Bringing her right hand up against her opponent's chest, she extended her mind, reaching into the glove and unlocking the power she'd bound within. The Minotaur howled as a brilliant arc of electrical energy surged through his body. The beast dropped to his knees and offered no resistance as Lei put her foot to his throat and pushed him to the ground. The smell of ozone and burned fur filled the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the Minotaur's labored breathing. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked up at her. "You may enter," he said. There was a distinct click, and the door to the temple swung open a few inches. "What of my friends?" "You have earned passage. For all." Lei nodded. "Then let's go." She looked over at Dane, and surprise spread over her face. "Dane!" He turned around. They had been so focused on the battle that they had not heard the others approach. Over a dozen men spread out behind them, wearing the green and black of the Sharn watch. Dane hadn't seen any watchmen during their earlier exploration of the district, and he had a sinking feeling this was no ordinary patrol. These men had the look of veteran soldiers, and the occasional spot of blood hinted at a recent clash with residents at the gate. 4 crossbows were leveled in their direction. 4 halberdiers moved into flanking positions, and the 4 closest men carried iron cudgels. The sergeant leveled his sword at Dane and said, "Lay down your arms. By the authority of the Lord Mayor of Sharn, I hereby declare you under arrest for the heinous crime of murder." Jode looked up at Dane. "Well, I guess no one caught him." Chapter 12. The Land Sharn. Dane studied the enemy and their surroundings, strategies flashing through his mind. None were good. The numbers were against them. Lei was unarmed, and all he had was his thrice-damned dagger. Even if they could fight, the guards were just doing their jobs, and resisting arrest would only make matters worse. For a moment, Dane thought about running for the open door of the church, but they had no idea what was inside or any reason to believe they would be offered shelter against the law. "Captain?" Pierce said quietly. Dane knew that the Forged could drop 2 of the archers in the first few seconds of battle, but it just wasn't enough. There were no real alternatives. Slowly, Dane set his dagger on the ground and gestured for the others to follow suit. Guards surrounded them and bound their wrists, and they were led out of the district. The guards were silent and tense, and the halberdiers and archers kept their weapons at the ready, as if they expected an attack to come at any moment. Maybe they did. Goblins glared from the shadows, and an ogre sneered at the guards' men, revealing filthy fangs. The watch was not welcome in Malian's gate, and only sheer numbers protected the patrol. Dane was impressed. Clearly, this force had been dispatched to track them down and apprehend them only hours after the guard's death. Even in Metrol, Dane wouldn't have expected such a swift response, and with Sharn's sordid reputation, he had half expected that the law wouldn't even try to solve the crime, though the fact that the victim was a guardsman probably had a great deal to do with the speed of the response. They made it out of Malian's gate without incident, and the guards relaxed as they boarded a lift and rose up through the towers. Nothing could keep Jode quiet, and he'd managed to strike up a conversation with one of the guards as they were moving out of the district. Now that they were standing still, Dane picked up on the end of the conversation.
Caralag,
Jode said.
I've heard he's got quite a few tricks tucked away. He's a gargoyle, said the captor, a half-elf woman with short silvery hair and freckled cheeks. It doesn't matter how tricky he is. He just doesn't have the wingspan to compete with a Pegasus or Hippogriff.
Darus! Don't talk to the prisoners. The sergeant was almost as large as Pierce, and Dane guessed that he owed his gray complexion and flat nose to orcish blood. The half-elf nodded sullenly and turned away from Jode.
We're going to Dagger's Watch,
Jode whispered, sidling up to Dane. Dagger Watch was the garrison district Jode had mentioned earlier. Great. So while I'm being boiled in oil, why don't you try to ask a few questions about Raciel?
What's interesting is that the guard didn't know anything about the nature of our crime. She knew that the charge was murder, but she was instructed to apprehend you and anyone you might be traveling with. Let's face it, you're the killer.
Thanks, Jode. Good to know you're standing at my side. Besides which, you stabbed the woman.
And healed her, Jode pointed out. But don't worry, I'm sure I can talk us through this. I was just thinking of Lay and Pierce. How could the Watch possibly hold them responsible?
Silence! The sergeant sent Jode sprawling with a kick. Dane gritted his teeth but stood his ground. The last time he'd fought on a lift, it had ended poorly, when the gray-skinned sergeant was looking for an excuse for further violence. That excuse came from an unexpected quarter. As the sergeant turned toward Dane, there was a flash of movement. Lay's foot caught the back of the half-orc's knee and sent him sprawling to the ground. The guards knew nothing of the enchantments Lay had woven for her battle with the Minotaur, and none were prepared for her blinding speed. She dove forward, stripped the rope from the hands of her captor, and rolled into a defensive crouch, raising her bound fists before her like a mace. The sergeant rose to his feet and drew his blade. I'll have your foot for that, mourner trash.
Try me, brute, she hissed. You saw that Minotaur a minute ago. I did that with my bare hands. You touch my friends again, and you'll be kissing cobblestones before you can blink.
The sergeant watched her through narrowed eyes, and Dane caught the hint of motion he made with his sword. The four archers readied themselves, moving along the perimeter and preparing to fire on a moment's notice. Pierce caught Dane's glance, and his thoughts were clear. For all her supernatural speed, Lay couldn't fight the guards alone. Either they acted together, or... Lay, stand down, Dane said firmly. I'm the one you want here, Grayskin. If you're going to take your anger out on someone, deal with me. Lay remained in her crouch. Behind her, the archers were taking aim. Lay! Reluctantly, Lay lowered her arms. A guard took hold of her tether, but the others were taking no chances. Two of the archers kept their crossbows leveled at her back. The sergeant walked over the face with the pommel of his sword, knocking him to the ground. Glaring down, the half-orc spat at him and turned away. Slowly, Dane rose to his feet and shuffled over towards Lay. "I never thought you'd be the one to start a fight," he muttered, testing his teeth with his tongue.
"I never thought you'd be the one to stop me," she replied.
He could see the anger in her eyes, but the archers still stood at the ready, fingers white on the stocks of their crossbows. "I fought too many fights that couldn't be won. I'm proud of what you did, now and earlier, but it's not the time. Let's see where this takes us." She nodded, but she wouldn't meet his gaze. The lift came to a stop, and they were escorted through the streets of Daggerwatch. Every district seemed to have its own flavor, and Daggerwatch was no exception. It had the atmosphere of a vast fortress. The walls were reinforced to resist siege weaponry, and guardsmen filled the streets. Compared to the lower districts and even Den Iyas, the streets were remarkably quiet. People spoke in lowered voices, and even the merchants refrained from hawking their wares. A pair of hippogriffs wheeled overhead, and Dane could see soldiers riding the beasts. Once, Raciel Tan had been up there. "It's quite clean, I'll give it that," Jode remarked. "I wonder who cleans up all the hippogriff shit." A guard shoved him with the butt of a halberd. They passed a large open square containing a circle of pillories. A group of criminals were on display, heads and hands pinned in the wooden restraints. A few spectators were throwing refuse at prisoners. But even this behavior seemed rather quiet and reserved compared to what Dane had come to expect. Daggerwatch was home to the local military as well as the Sharn Watch. Occasionally, squads of Brelish soldiers passed by, some marching in district formation, others off-duty and drifting. Dane was still wearing his Syrian uniform, and he was greeted with sneers and the occasional thrown stone. They reached their destination. Daggerwatch Garrison was an impressive sight. The stone walls were 2 feet thick, studded with arrow slits and murder holes, and Dane could see a few archers watching them as they approached. There were deep scars in a few spots along the wall, as if acid or fire had eaten away at the rock. Apparently, the fortifications had been tested in the past. A massive stone hippogriff stood to either side of the gate, foreclaws raised and ready to strike. Dane wondered if the statues would come to life if there was an attack. Entering the garrison, they were surrounded by even more guards. Steel manacles replaced their rope bonds. Apparently, the Sharn Watch was taking no chances. The sergeant conferred with an administrator in black and green robes. The sergeant looked displeased with the news, but Dane couldn't hear the conversation. Eventually, he returned and spoke quietly with his men. The sergeant nodded to Dane. The next thing he knew, there was a splitting pain in the back of his head, and everything went blank. When his senses returned, he was lying on the hard stone floor. He opened his eyes expecting to see the dim light of a prison cell. Instead, he was surprised by bright illumination and a soft carpet beneath his head. His skull was throbbing from where he'd been sapped, but no permanent damage seemed to have been done. Something seemed wrong, and then he realized his manacles had been removed. "Well, Dane, who'd have thought we'd meet like this? Oleandra's done you no favors, I see." The voice was familiar, but in his dazed state, Dane had trouble placing it. Rising to his knees, he struggled to take in his surroundings. By the granite floor and walls, he judged he was still inside the Daggerwatch garrison, perhaps an officer's chamber. A tapestry covered the wall in front of him, depicting the famous battle between the sentinel marshals of House Deneth and the bandit king of the Whistling Wood. But the voice had come from his right. Dane shook the cobwebs from his head and turned to face the voice. A man sat behind a beautiful desk of arenal dense wood. The seal of Sharn dominated the wall behind the desk. Dane's vision was slightly blurred, but he could see that the man was wearing the uniform of a captain. He squinted, and the stranger's face came into focus. "Grayson?" he said, shocked. "Grayson de Denith?" The captain laughed and stood up. "For a moment I thought the guards had done you permanent damage. Mourner soldiers aren't well liked in Daggerwatch." He walked around the desk and offered Dane a hand, pulling him to his feet. "But it's Grayson Irtala now." Dane shook his head, trying to process this information. "What? What can I say?" Grayson ran a hand through his golden brown hair and smiled. "Love conquers all. I was a Sentinel Marshal back when we last saw each other, yes? I had an extended tour of duty in Sharn, pursuing a group of Lazar assassins. During my stay, I met a lovely young woman who happened to be the sole heir of a wealthy estate. And after some thought, I decided to leave the house and settle in Sharn. It may sound like madness, I know, but I'm not the first to leave his house voluntarily." Grayson pointed Dane toward a chair, then returned to his desk. Dane sat down, still absorbing the information. But what am I doing here? Like I said, I had served a long tour of duty here. When he heard I was staying, Lord Commander Ian was quite happy to offer me a commission. So here I am today. I have a lovely wife, a vast fortune, 2 beautiful children, albeit unmarked, and a position that offers me considerable authority and respect. I'm glad to see that you've managed to do as well for yourself." Dane's head had cleared, but he chose not to respond to the barb. "But you were always one for lost causes, aren't you, Dane? And look what he got you. According to Sergeant Ollis, you didn't have a sword when they apprehended you. I wonder what your grandfather would say about that." Dane clenched his fists, but held his ground. "Let's get this over with, Grayson. I killed your man, I admit it. But it was an accident, and my companions had nothing to do with it. Ah, yes. Your little motley crew. You always knew how to pick your companions. Speaking of which, have you seen Alina lately?" Dane was caught off guard. "What?" "Oh, she's here in Sharn. I just thought you might want to reminisce some old times. In any case, you're mistaken." Grayson smirked. "You haven't killed anyone." He reached into a belt pouch and produced a platinum disc, which he tossed to Dane. The symbol of a feather was engraved on the surface, along with an assortment of mystical glyphs. "Feather token. Only one use. But it's a lifesaver if you find yourself plummeting to your death. If you live on the upper levels and you can afford one, you're a fool not to. Sergeant Lorak is no fool. I suppose that I could have sent Lorak to bring you in, but I had to spoil the surprise. I'd stay out of Lorak's way if I were you. He may be alive, but he's certainly one to hold a grudge. And I understand you kept him from having a little fun." "Yeah, fun," Dane said, thinking of the goblin girl. "Great crew you've got here. So the murder charge, you just made that up? Would you have come if I'd just asked?" "I don't know. At least you're honest. Something that's all too rare these days." He studied Dane carefully. "What do you say if I offer you a job, Dane? It wouldn't be easy, given that you were an officer for the enemy. But Seer's gone now, and it's not coming back. And I've got connections here. Feel like working for a winner for a change?" "What's that got to do with you?" Grayson laughed. I've missed you, Dane. Well, I'll give you a few days to think about it. But a few words of advice. Stay away from Alina. Stay out of trouble. And keep an eye out for Sergeant Lorak. In light of our old friendship, I will ask what you were doing in Malian's Gate. But friendship or not, this is where my heart lies now. You haven't crossed any lines yet, but if you do, I'll be right here to bring you down. Thanks for the advice, Grayson. It's been great catching up like this. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to get back to my friends. Of course. He ran a finger over an alarm stone on his desk, and 2 guards entered the room. Mina, Dal, escort our guest back to his companions, and see that his possessions are restored to him. He looked back at Dane. Think about my offer, Dane, and my advice. It might be the only chance you have left to do the right thing. Dane said nothing as the guards led him away. Jode, Pierce, and Lay were waiting for him in the atrium.
Dane, Lay called. What's going on?
It was all a misunderstanding. You mean someone did catch him? Jode said. A servant brought in their weapons and began to distribute them. Something like that, yeah. The servant reached him. She handed Dane his dagger and then gave him a long sword with a scabbard and harness of black leather. This isn't mine, Dane said.
Compliments of Captain Grayson, she replied. He said you lost your own blade.
It was a beautiful weapon, even in the scabbard. Lay glanced at the weapon and frowned.
Dane, why?
He followed her gaze and saw the Eye in the Sun sigil of House Deneath engraved on the pommel, glittering in the light of the cold fire. It belonged to an old friend, he said. Apparently, he doesn't have a use for it anymore. He considered handing it back to the servant, but a sword was a sword. Scowling, he buckled on the harness. Now let's get out of here.